Hello everyone, so in this tutorial here I'm going to show you how to draw a black and white cat in pastels. So this was a pet portrait commission that I was asked to do last year, and I thought this would make for a really good tutorial here. Black and white fur are very difficult to draw. They're one of the most challenging fur types that I found when I first started using pastels. So when I was asked by a few Patreon members to get a tutorial like this uploaded, I knew that this was the one that I wanted to use. So I want to focus the white and the black fur for this video here, but I'll just quickly mention one of the things about the eyes here. So when I'm working on lighter coloured eyes like this, and this was a lovely powder blue, baby blue type colour, I wanted to start off with those lighter colours first. Now the reason being is I wanted to make sure that I had those as bright as I needed to. She had really stunning coloured eyes here, so I wanted to make sure that I could get those as pure as possible. If you start off with a darker base layer and try and add your lighter colours on top, although we can do that very easily with pastels, it's a lot more forgiving when you're trying to keep that vibrancy colour, in this case to add the lighter layer first. So for the eyes I worked in the opposite way, light to dark, than I would normally, which is obviously as what I'm doing here, dark to light. So onto the black fur of the face. The main aim when we're drawing black fur is you want to get that contrast. You want to get that colour as dark as you possibly can. At the moment here I'm using my black Carbothello. I have just started using the black Creator colour, and that by far is much more darker. Now, the much slower video of this on Patreon is split into two parts, and they total just over 6.5 hours in footage. So the videos are considerably slower. I'm telling you exactly why I'm layering in that way, the colours that I'm using, and so on. So if that would be of interest, I'll link my Patreon channel in the description below. And also with the black fur here, you'll notice that I've gone with the darkest colour right from the beginning. I haven't started off with a muted grey, because we then run the risk of making that cat look like a grey cat rather than a black cat, which is obviously not what we want. The abilities with the pastels, and especially working on Pastelmat, is that we can layer all of these lighter details on top. So you want to make sure that you get that base layer as dark as you need to at that initial stage. And this is one of the things that can be quite daunting, and that's the fear of going too dark, because we're a little bit worried then that we're going to potentially go too dark and then spoil that portrait. But just as I've mentioned, if we don't go dark enough here, we're not going to make it look like black fur. And as long as you don't feel the tooth of that paper too early on, we are going to then be able to lighten that layer. So even if you did find that you made it a little bit too dark, it can be fixed. Working on Pastelmat is very forgiving. So here is a prime example where I don't put the black everywhere. I am mixing it with blue as well, and I do speak about this process a lot in the slower Patreon version. But I don't want to use flat black because it can look quite flat on its own. I either want to add a blue, or in some cases I'll add a purple as well. For this I went with a really nice, not too vibrant, but a muted dark blue for my base layer, and then layered my darker pencils on top. I'm still following that reference photo really closely, even though I've blocked in such a large area with that solid dark colour. You'll see that above her eyes I still made sure there that I didn't add all of that black all the way to the top of her eyelid. There is a lighter section there, so I made sure that I went in with a dark grey. But again, I still need to make sure here, even with the grey type of areas where the light is reflecting off that black fur, that I still make sure that grey is dark enough. So I like to work in small sections, as you can see here. Once I got the top of her face and the ears done, they were pretty much completed here. I started working on the nose and the fur around it. This is certainly my preference, and I find that when I'm working on something where there is a solid colour like this, breaking it down into small areas stops me from rushing. I think it's something that we all can be guilty of, where if you've got one area that's one solid colour, we have a tendency to block all of that in right from the start, and then we'll just not only be using the same sets of pencils, but also layering the same colour all over that one area. Whereas if you look here, there are so many variations, so many different greys, different highlights over the top of this dark fur, that we really want to make sure that we capture that early on. I also find that working in small sections, especially from left to right, means that I don't have a tendency to smudge my work. Now you'll all see under every single video that I've got here on YouTube that I always have a sheet of glassine under my hand. I find that's really important. I haven't yet had any issues with smudging my work, but it's something that I am very careful of. If I work in small sections like what I'm working on here, I do find that I don't have any reason particularly to have to lay my hand over that area. So that is of course another reason why I like to work in small areas. So when it comes to drawing white fur, I find that the layering process is very similar, but I want to be a little bit more cautious, making sure that I don't go too dark. In the layering process, I'm still making sure that I'm studying that photo and getting my tones in as close to that reference photo as I can. You can see here that this is already indicating that her head is slightly turned to one side and she's got a little bit of that ruffle on the side of her cheek from her shoulder. So I want to make sure here that I'm still mapping in my lights and my darks. But as I say, I do approach the white fur slightly differently. I want to make sure that I don't go too dark because I don't want this fur to look like a dark grey. I don't want it to look... It can reflect various colours, but I still want to give the illusion that obviously this is white fur. Now when we get to her chest area, you'll see that there is a lot of reflective colour that's bounced up from the floor that she's lying on. You do want to capture that to a degree, but if you've got an animal and it's led down on some grass and you're not drawing the grass in, that white fur will have a strong green tint to it in some cases. If I'm not drawing that grass in my portrait, I will take that green tint out of the fur because it will make it look like that animal, in this case that cat, has got green fur, but you're not drawing the grass to show that. So in those cases, I would take those additional colours out and focus more on your light greys and some of the cream reflections like what I'm working on here. The biggest tip with white fur is never truly white. Normally, the brightest part of a portrait is the reflections in the eyes. Now in this case, there isn't any bright reflections in the eyes because of how she's got her head slightly turned down. So there is more of that light source coming from the left-hand side on her shoulder and particularly her paws. So there's not one rule for each, but it is going to be therefore right down to that individual photo. One of the most important things that I talk about throughout my tutorials is the light source. So you really want to make sure that you're getting the direction of that light throughout the portrait. That's what's going to help with the contrast and the overall feel for that reference photo. We want it to look like that animal. If we don't get our highlights in the white or the black fur in the right place, we're going to completely not only change the anatomy potentially of that animal, but obviously, as I say, the light source that will really dramatically affect the overall portrait. Now I speak about this as well a lot in tutorials, how highlights and shadows aren't usually random. They do follow the muscular and skeletal system underneath the skin. So for instance here, the highlights as the nose starts to slope away to the cheek, that is indicating there that you've got that difference in that skeletal structure. The lighter patches above her eye, that's where her eye socket is. So all of these little variations are all going to add up to looking like that pet when your portrait is finished. And that's why I really do focus when I am drawing black or white fur to get these highlights in the right place. You want to make sure, regardless of what it is that you're drawing, the colour of that animal, that you're always getting your highlights and your shadows accurate for those reasons. So one of the areas where I really did focus a lot in depth on this Patreon version is these details that I'm working on here. These fine white details that overlap such a dark area can be really challenging to get looking fine and crisp. What can happen is these details can almost muddy up. They pick up an awful lot of the darker pigment underneath it and they don't therefore look like white details. For this, one of my main aims, as I say, was capturing that contrast between the dark fur and the light fur. So if I had my details here that were muddying up and almost creating a bit like a grey barrier between the two, where that white pencil picks up that darker pigment, it wouldn't have the same impact like what it does at the moment, having that sharp difference between her two markings. So that's another area in the Patreon video where I really do go into a lot of depth for that. And once you've got the technique on making sure that those details are still looking white, you need to then be more confident with how to move that pencil to get those nice, longer, finer lines. So both of those techniques will then work together, and the more that you work with the pencil in that way, the more seamless those pencil strokes will become. It's something that we will then start to do just, by second nature. It will just start to become far more natural. And for me, I find making these longer but finer details are all in how much pressure you put on that pencil and how sharp that lead is. Those two things can really impact the kind of texture with the fur that we're trying to go for. And just like what I'm working on at the moment with her chest, the fur is going to vary depending on the texture, how soft that fur is. I find cat fur is very different to dog fur. It's that much longer in some cases, and it's a bit more denser looking, so it's a bit thicker. We want to make sure that we do capture that softness in this fur. One of the things as well that I talk a lot about is the fur length. We really want to make sure that we are capturing the length of that fur as accurately as we can to that reference photo. I wouldn't want to make the fur on her face as long as the fur on her chest, because obviously I'm then going to make it look like she's got a long coat on her face, which is not what we want. We want to make sure that there is that variation there between the different parts of the portrait to replicate the texture of the fur is starting to vary. And this is more so when we're working on a full body portrait like this. So if you've got something on the easel where you are asked to draw all of the body, really pay attention to the fur on the body compared to the face and the feet. The fur on the paws are going to be much shorter than most of the time than anywhere else. The bridge of the nose is the only other place where the fur usually is considerably shorter. All the other parts of the body, you might have some pencil strokes that require it to be a good amount longer. So let's say you've got a German Shepherd on the easel. The fur on the face is going to be considerably shorter than the fur on the body or the neck. So you really want to make sure that you are adjusting your pencil strokes accordingly. And here is a prime example of that. The fur on her belly here is that much longer. I needed to make sure then that I really did almost double the pencil stroke length here. And I also find where I hold the pencil and the angle that I've got my hand will ultimately affect the type of pencil stroke that I am after. Again, I do cover that a lot in my Patreon versions because I'm able to explain that because it's much slower footage. But you'll see that most of the time I'm holding my pencils in the middle or end of that barrel. I very rarely hold them right up close to the lead. Holding them like this means that these details that I'm working on at the moment, for instance, are able to be a lot finer. They're able to be a little bit more controlled because we're not having to put too much pressure on that lead. Therefore, the details are not coming out thick and grainy. One of the frustrations that I found when I was new to pastels is my details were not smooth. My primary medium before pastels was colour pencils, and you don't have that same issue. So I was really experimenting with how to get these pencils to create my nice soft details. And one of the things that I certainly found impacted that was heavier pressure. The more pressure you put on that pencil, the line will look thicker. It will then show more of that Pastelmat texture. So most of the time when I'm working on the details, I've got very minimal pressure on that pencil. Now when it comes to drawing paws, this is one element of the Patreon version where I really did focus on this, because paws never look right until you've got many layers into the process. So the very first few base layers and even the first couple of detailed layers don't look very good. What we need to keep on doing, especially when the paws are white like this, because there's no markings here to break up this larger section, especially when you've got the toes here and the way that they curve over, we want to be making sure that we are adding our subtle shadows in between. I want to make sure that I've got the shadows on the toes, just like what I'm starting to work on here. This is now already starting to indicate that the toes are curving over. It's certainly one of the elements of a cat portrait where it can really throw you off. Working upside down and turning your reference photo upside down for any element of the portrait that you might be struggling with can really help. Your brain will be forced to see those as abstract shapes rather than a cat's paw. Because at the moment when you work in the right way up, your brain is thinking, I know what a cat's foot looks like. So you have a tendency to not follow the reference photo as closely as you think you are. And this paw again is another prime example. It's turned slightly more towards the viewer, so you're able to see a little bit more of the undersurface of this leg. So that can then make it even more confusing to draw. So this is certainly where I would recommend, if you can, turn your artwork and your reference photo upside down. It can really help. All of these finer details that you can see I've overlapped onto the black markings of her legs here make this look so much more realistic. These details for me, just like when I add the whiskers at the very end, really do finish off the portrait. And I think that adding these lighter details on top can be one of the most challenging parts, because we still want to make sure that they are looking like white details rather than grey. We also then have the additional pressure of making sure that we are still following that fur direction. We want to make sure that we are replicating the shape of these legs. Where these lighter details almost look like they spiral from the left and then slowly curve over to the right, is showing you that you have that curve of the top part of the leg. All of these little details are helping to make these legs look three-dimensional. If I didn't have all of the variation with these lighter details over the black markings, this leg would almost look very flat, very 2D. And the finished photo of my artwork in the corner there, you can really see how sharp my contrasts are. The black looks really dark, but that's also helping that in order to get that contrast, because I've got my highlights as bright as they need to be. Something that can happen is you might think that your black colours do not look as dark, but that's quite often because your area next to it, the whiter markings, aren't bright enough. As soon as you brighten up those areas, it will make your shadows look that much darker. And that can go for anything, not just drawing black or white fur. So here's a larger version of my portrait here, the one that was in the corner of the tutorial. I've added that subtle shadow underneath her so it doesn't look like she's floating on the portrait. And the lighting, the highlights on the black fur, on the white fur, how I've adjusted my pencil strokes in order to get those various lengths of fur is also helping with the perspective. She's got her paws stretched out in front of her, so I wanted to make sure that I captured that 3D effect from that reference photo as much as I could. So I really hope this tutorial was of use. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up. And if you like the content that I create, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if any of the tutorials here and the slower versions are of interest, as I say, I will link my Patreon channel in the description below. If you've got any questions about drawing black or white fur, pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to answer any, and I'll be uploading another video here next week.